for the invitation to come and speak to you about this. This is a pretty monumental undertaking in terms of the measurement of skills. Literacy, and it tends to get characterized as a survey of literacy, which I think is a bit of a misnomer. It's actually much more than that. It's actually much more of a survey and a measure of how people actually process information in whatever form that information is provided. Whether it's in written form, whether it's related to numeracy, or in terms of problem solving. So it's far more than simply a literacy, and it's actually it and some of its predecessors, which which have been in place over the years. But this program, which was run by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is for those of you who don't know, it is a multilateral organization that's based in Paris, really advanced the yardsticks with respect to issues of literacy. We used to talk about literacy as somebody being either literate or not literate, or illiterate. It was really a binary kind of approach to understanding what people's ability to understand the written word. It's far, far more than that, and PIAAC, which is, by the way, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, actually allows us to score people's skills and actually put them on a scale. So that we can get a sense of how we as a population are moving, improving, or otherwise, and who within the country is faring well or not so well, and allows us to draw our attention to certain groups in the population that may need additional assistance. So, as I said, this is an initiative that was put in place by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It looks at a number of different things, different components. It looks at literacy, it looks at numeracy, and there's a new component of this particular survey, which is something that they've not done in any precursor to PIAAC, which is something known as the problem solving in a technology-rich environment. I always get a little bit confused. Anything that starts with the letters PS, we tend to refer to it as PSTRE. I always think everything starts with PS is going to be a video game, but that's not entirely what it is. It was a large undertaking. Quite a number of countries have participated in the first round of PIAAC. There are 24 countries, which allows us an ability to benchmark ourselves as well as a country against some of our competitors, if you will, or other countries that are out there from whom we might actually be able to learn if they're actually performing better than we are. There will be a second round of PIAAC with a handful of countries in 2014-15, and the OECD right now is actually looking to construct a third round. So there'll be quite a range of countries against which we have an ability to compare ourselves down the road. And so just to run you through a little bit of what PIAAC is in concrete terms. There's a direct assessment. So when I say it's a survey of sorts in a sense, and that we could tend to call these things surveys because they're run by StatsCan. It's not really so much a survey per se. There are component parts of it which are actually more of a questionnaire, like what kind of work do you do, where do you live, what's your family income, all of that kind of stuff. And that's basically your background questionnaire. It allows us to set the context and understand who it is that that we're actually running through this test and assessing their skills. There's a questionnaire on the use of skills in the workplace for those who are in the workplace. But there are 4 direct measures that are in place through PIAAC. There's a direct assessment of literacy skills, a direct assessment of numeracy. As I said, there's the problem solving in a technology-rich environment component of it. And there's a direct assessment of the reading components as well, which is more to better understand those people who we see who have poor reading skills, so that we can actually get a better handle on that. Now, just to give you a background for those of you who are not, who aren't aware, although Brandon will be able to tell us a little bit more about their role in this, this was really a partnership. The department that I work for, Employment and Social Development Canada, worked very closely with the Council of Ministers of Education Canada, and we've also, which of course, and through them with the provinces and territories. But there are also a handful of other federal government departments that are involved in this as well, which we brought to the table to look at very specific components or parts of the Canadian population. So we're working with CanNor, which is a development agency in the north. We're looking at, we work with Citizenship and Immigration Canada as well, and Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development, as well as the Public Health Agency of Canada. All of these organizations have come on stream for this because they have a particular interest to use the results out of PIAAC to look at populations of interest to them. Whether it's a question, and in terms of the Public Health Agency of Canada, they're very much wanting to, down the road, when they get their head around what this data is telling them, draw links between information processing skills, literacy, numeracy, and other skills with what it means for individuals' well-being, beyond whether it be individual health or at community level for that matter. So Canada is in a unique position in terms of the 24 countries that participated in this. The average sample for the vast majority of countries was somewhere in the, well, I think the minimum was around 5,000, which they would typically consider to be a sizable enough survey size to actually be able to extract information about the population. Canada actually surveyed 27,000 people, so that we could actually have samples that were sufficient for us to know what's going on at a provincial level as well as a national level, but also to be able to get at some of the subpopulations in the country that are of interest. So we're looking at official language minority communities, the immigrant population, as well as the Aboriginal population. So I'll give you a bit of a glimpse of where we stand. In terms of literacy, Canada, it's kind of like, yay, we're average. But indeed, that's exactly where we landed. We're right in the middle column within that group of what are sort of the average scoring countries. And what we've done here as well is we've mapped across, throughout that particular diagram, sort of where the individual provinces rest as well. And I've highlighted Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia actually is bang on the Canadian average with respect to literacy. We do have a little bit, the average score only tells you so much, mind you. We have a bit of an unusual distribution in that we actually have more people than the average at the lower levels of literacy and higher than the OECD average in the highest literacy levels as well, which is something that's unique to Canada. Well, not necessarily unique to Canada, but certainly do stand out as compared to the OECD writ large. Now, if you compare us, mind you, in terms of English-speaking countries, there's only Australia that does any better than Canada. This is, as I say, really just a first blush as to what it is, where it is that we rank. We obviously will have an enormous amount of work to do to better understand some of the whys, not just the whats. Numeracy is one which has attracted some attention because we don't fare so well. In respect to the OECD, we actually fall somewhat below. Now, they're not dramatic numbers, mind you, when you look at the actual score. But considering the size of the sample that we have in Canada, the precision of that estimate is actually quite high. So it is, we do look at it as with some confidence in terms of the accuracy of that number. So, we do fall below the OECD average. And one of the things that's telling here, which is not particularly encouraging either, and this has been noted in some of the press releases, in particular those that were issued by the Council of Ministers of Education, that numeracy is a source of some concern. And when we look at the figures, we see that there isn't a single province or territory in Canada that actually scores above the OECD average. We're either at the average or below the OECD average. As far as the problem solving in a technology-rich environment is concerned, I'll paint the picture in sort of steps, if you will. When you look at the figures here, we actually fare relatively well as compared to the OECD average. The Canadian average is somewhat above, and doesn't look, and you have to look at this in a sense that there's the average score. The average score is a little bit higher than it is in the OECD, but the distribution is sort of what I'm plotting here. The PSTRE is presented it's got 3 levels that are presented in terms of ranges of scores, if you will, across the scale. There's a sizable, in particular in some parts of the country, there are sizable parts of the population that actually fall below level 1, if you will, which is a base problem-solving ability. But what's interesting about the Canadian context in comparison to other countries, and I'll move to the next slide, is that there was a particularity to the way the PSTRE was run. You could do, in this particular instance, when they ran PIAAC, unlike its predecessors, there was an ability to do a computer-based assessment, but you could choose whether you wanted to do the computer-based assessment or whether you wanted to do it on, with pen and paper. You needed to be doing this on computer to be able to do, to actually complete the component on the PSTRE component. what we've mapped here is sort of the different provinces and territories in terms of the completion rates, if you will. Now, there are those who, for some reason or another, did not complete at all. They basically started the survey and basically put it aside and never completed it. So, relatively small number of them, mind you, somewhere between sort of 1 and 3%, 1 and 4% of respondents across the country didn't complete it at all. You had those who had no computer experience whatsoever, and so chose to do it on pen and paper. You had those, well, not only chose, they had no choice but to do pen and paper, and so they didn't do the PSTRE. You had those that, while choosing to do the computer-based assessment, were first given a very basic test, like do they actually have the basic skills required to be able to complete this on computer. Like really basic. You basically had to be able to take the mouse and highlight something in a text, or underline something, or do a cut and paste. That was about as complicated as it got. And there's a segment of the population that didn't actually complete that successfully. So there you were looking at 6% of Canadian respondents couldn't actually do that. And then you had those who simply opted out of the computer-based assessment, but you don't really know why. They might have been a question of familiarity, comfort level with technology. And so you ended up with, in Canada, roughly 81% of the population doing the computer-based assessment and then able to do the PSTRE. Now, that number actually stands in contrast to the OECD. We actually had a higher proportion of people that were doing the PSTRE than other countries. And so the fact that we fared well as compared to the OECD average is actually even better when you think about it, because those who didn't do it, one would assume that it's those who, if they have no basic computer skills, if they have no familiarity with computers whatsoever, one might assume might not have done particularly well in this particular assessment of their problem-solving skills. So if you take that in mind, we actually had a higher proportion of people complete it. So it actually enforces or reinforces the statement that we actually did better than the OECD average, and that actually complements that and reinforces that statement. So that was one positive note that came out of PIAAC for Canada. So I'll just take it apart a little bit. We'll move on to some of the disaggregation of some of the results. So we'll just move to the next. So just breaking it down by socioeconomic categories. Looking at it by age. Literacy and numeracy peaked across the age spectrum between the ages of 25 and 34. And now, while I use the term declined with older age groups, that's not really the word I wanted to use because it doesn't necessarily decline with age, but certainly in higher age groups, the scores were a little bit lower. And that was true for literacy and numeracy. Canadian youth didn't do particularly well. They're actually lower than the OECD average. And that is something that is certainly, I've been a little bit surprised to see that it hasn't attracted the attention in the media that I expected it to. When we originally saw these results and we're expecting sort of reactions in the press, that was one of the areas that we honestly thought would get picked up. And I think with time and as people wrap their heads around all of the data that's available in PIAAC, that's going to be something that people are going to want to pay much more attention to. The flip side of that, mind you, where we do a little bit better is in the higher age groups, we actually do better than the OECD average. So we do have this sort of odd age distribution. In terms of gender, no real surprises there. Literacy, there are no significant differences between men and women. Numeracy, as we've observed for a long time, men have a tendency to do somewhat better than women, and this bears it out again. By education level, again, you expect literacy levels to be higher for higher educated, and that is indeed the case. And what we do see as well is that with the presence of higher education, the literacy scores of people don't tend to drop as much in advance. So age, or the effects of age, if you want to call it that, seem to be offset by higher education. Now that may actually be in some sense the education effect directly, but it may also be the fact that people with a higher education may be in jobs where the use of those skills is more current, and therefore they actually maintain them over time as well. Labor force attachment obviously plays a role, but what's interesting here, and I'll sort of look at the difference between unemployed and out of the labor force, and sort of levels, and what we have in levels 3 and levels 4, 5, the higher levels in literacy. There's very, very little difference. One can imagine quite a number of different explanations for that. But it's not entirely clear at this stage on the surface what it is. I mean, the people who are not in the labor force is quite a mixed bag, unlike those who are unemployed. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind as well when we're looking at this data and trying to understand what's going on is that this survey was run at the tail end of 2011 and into 2012. And there's still sort of lingering effects of the recession. And one would expect that, we know that there are some sectors, that there are some types of occupations in some regions where, that were affected more heavily by others during the recession. And that may actually then have an effect on sort of like, who is it? When you compare those skill levels with the higher skills levels of individuals who are employed at the time that the survey was conducted, may suggest either that people with lower levels of education or lower skills may actually have been more affected by the recession. That's something we're going to have to disentangle. It's not just a question of the fact that their skills are lower and they are more likely to be unemployed, but given the cycle, that may have been something that had a strengthening effect on that observation, if you will, and that the big difference between employed and unemployed may have been driven by the skill levels and the sectors that were affected in the 2008 recession. The other thing, mind you, that is really puzzling at this stage, if you actually look down under the skill levels, and sort of management and A, which are occupations which typically are thought to require the higher skill level, the higher education, 28%, or 6% of individuals in that category actually had the lowest levels of literacy, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. And nearly a quarter of people who were at level 2 were actually in management functions and in the A category of the National Occupational Classification, which are supposed to be the highest skilled jobs we have. So there's something going on there, whether it's the fact that there are obviously skills well beyond literacy that affect people's ability in the labor market and their competencies that may be sought by employers. But it is nevertheless striking to see numbers that high for people in the highest paid jobs and in the jobs with the highest skill requirements who their measured literacy was actually at the bottom end of the scale. Now you get a very similar mapping of where people land if you look at it by earnings. There are actually, you get the same kind of thing where there's a significant number of people with relatively low literacy skills who are in the top earners. So, we really have to try and unpack that and try and understand what's going on that front and what are some of the factors that allow people to succeed as well as they do. If we look at the subpopulations, so Aboriginal populations in Canada, not surprisingly, have lower literacy levels than the general population. Literacy, numeracy, PSTRE, pretty much the same story across the board. But it varies quite a bit by jurisdiction. And the gap, in fact, in some jurisdictions is relatively small. And we do need to figure out what's going on so that, what we're observing is that in some areas, the Aboriginal populations are doing particularly poorly, and in other places, they're actually pretty close to the non-Aboriginal population in the same jurisdiction. What are the differences that underpin, what are the differences either in circumstances, in policy and programs in the education system? What is it that actually affects that gap as being smaller or larger? Because it would suggest that there's considerable gains to be made and people who are actually able to achieve those gains. And so how can we transport some of those lessons into other jurisdictions? As far as the immigrant population, bit of a surprise, not that much of a difference between recent immigrants and established immigrants to the country. The literacy levels are relatively similar. What's interesting, mind you, that in Canada is that we actually do far, far better than the overwhelming majority of countries in the OECD. While their literacy levels are lower than the general population by and large, the gap between non-immigrants and immigrants in Canada is much smaller than it is in other countries in the OECD. But we're doing something right. But to be perfectly honest, we probably don't know what we're doing right. So it might just be luck of the draw. And we need to understand that so that we can actually make sure we continue to do that. There are a lot of examples of that, unfortunately, in sort of skills development that we sometimes succeed and we don't know why. And we shouldn't be complacent about it and just continue on, because in many instances what we observe as outcomes for people is the result of long-standing sort of policies and practices, some of which have had an impact on people 10, 20, 30 years ago, that's still having an impact today. And policies may have changed quite considerably since the 10 or 20 or 30 year ago model. And we may not be doing it as well as we used to, but we don't actually know that. So we need really to look at this very, very carefully to understand what is going on with that population. As far as the official language minority communities is concerned, there again, the minority communities tend to be doing less well than their majority counterparts, with Anglophones in Quebec being the exception. I was asked a question earlier on when we were having lunch about sort of how this compares with the past. It's a complicated question, and I'm not sure we actually have an answer to it. What I've got here, mind you, does show you how we fared on literacy and numeracy as compared to one of the precursors to PIAAC, which is the International Assessment of, no, what was it again?
Adult Literacy and Skills Survey.
Adult Literacy and Life Skills Survey. Problem is that the survey has been redesigned, although they tried very hard at the OECD to reconstruct it in a way where they were comparable. But what we do know is that there are some countries that improved considerably since IELTS, and others that have deteriorated, as we did. And the OECD can't quite come up with the explanation for that at this stage, so there are some question marks around direct comparability of data. So those of you who want to say we're doing better or worse than we did in 2003 when IELTS was in the field, may have to wait for the answer to that question, because the differences are not trivial. And probably what's most striking is the fact that both in literacy and in numeracy, we've got fewer people in the top skills levels, and somewhat more in the bottom skills levels. And so something is going on in terms of the distribution of skills across the country. And as I say, the average scores have dropped both in terms of literacy and numeracy. So superficially, certainly a source of concern, but we've got a lot of work to do to figure out whether or not it's as dire as what this might suggest. If we look at it across age groups, it actually gets worse. Across the age spectrum, we see exactly the same thing, whether again you're looking at, so we've got IELTS, which is the, if you want to go to the next one, if you look at IELTS, which is the left-hand side of the graph, and PIAAC on the right, every single sort of bar, if you're looking at the top shading of blue, every single one of them in PIAAC is smaller than it was in IELTS in 2003. So we have fewer people right across the age spectrum at the very top. And that's true, even if you look at the sort of levels 3, 4, and 5, we've got fewer people at the high end. But where the deterioration appears, at least, to be worse is in the younger age groups. And that's got to be...
People will be confused because they have a handout and that one is actually blank. So if people are looking for that in their handout, it's
That's
not
interesting.
there.
Worked on mine. But that's not going to help anybody. So I think if you look at the very top line, the light blue, and even if you combine that with the bar below it, the purple, those are the sort of the higher levels of skills that are being measured. In every age group, we did worse in PIAAC than we did in IELTS in 2003. As I say, the comparability is something that we need to investigate, but certainly on the surface, there is something that would suggest there may be a problem. But the problem seems to be worse for the younger age groups, and that, I think, is something that's going to attract a considerable amount of attention. As I said...
The distribution along the bottom, those are age brackets? Those are age groups 15 to...
That's 15, yeah, there's 15, 24, and then all the way up to 55 to 65. So,
I'll ask you later.
okay, fair enough. So, go ahead. So just to give you a sense, though, as I said, the comparability of these numbers is something that we'll need to pay attention to, because, and I'd point to Italy in particular as being sort of one of those countries that's a little bit hard to believe. In PIAAC, although we can't exactly calculate this exactly, the assumption is that for every roughly 7 points or so on the scale, in terms of the average scale, would be equivalent to roughly a year of education. And if you look at Italy, that's gone up by about 25 points, you're looking at a 3.5 year of education equivalent improvement in their national level literacy score in a decade. Kind of a little hard to swallow. And so, as I said, the OECD is still struggling with understanding either the scope and the scale of improvement in some countries and the deterioration in other countries, where there doesn't necessarily seem to be either a cohort effect, an age effect, a compositional effect in the population, or any significant policy changes that might actually lead one to believe these changes. And so there is work to do before we can actually declare, I think with confidence, particularly when we start disaggregating the data, whether or not things are truly better or worse. So, giving you a sense of at least some of the high-level scores and some of the things that we're drawing from sort of just like pulling the data together, but certainly some of the things that we're going to be doing over the course of the next couple of years, at least. We'll be doing a little bit of work on the one hand, as a lot of governments, nationally, provincially, right around the world for that matter, are moving to sort of different platforms for the delivery of services, and moving more and more to electronic delivery. Some of the results that we saw in the problem solving in a technology-rich environment part of PIAAC are a source of some concern. You know, if you've got 17, 18, 19% of the population that didn't do that because they either don't have any computer experience or couldn't even get through the basic assessment of their skills, how are you going to deliver programs to these people if you're moving only to an electronic-based delivery? So we want to look more carefully at who these individuals are, what the challenges were, and understand exactly, what it is that might be necessary in terms of making sure the programs the government wants to deliver can get into the hands of those that need them. We'll also be, as I say, looking very, very closely at the PIAAC sort of IELTS comparability, and we'll be working with Statistics Canada to sort of unpack that. And see, because one of the issues about why these things are fluctuating wildly across countries is that we don't really know how some of these surveys may play in different cultural contexts and different linguistic contexts. Because in many instances, these were delivered in whatever the predominant language of the country was. So some of those differences may actually play out in terms of the comparability over time. So we'll need to get our head around that. There'll be 3 quicker kind of reports where we'll focus our attention on the one hand on skills in the north, one on employment and earnings and information processing skills, and another on skills education and the Aboriginal population. Those are 3 reports where we'll be presenting more of more descriptive statistics, if you will, and those will all be done between now and early spring. But then over the course of about 2 years, we and our partners, whether it's CMEC or other departments, but we'll probably have at ESDC some role to play in every one of these, much more detailed, analytical, sort of multivariate analysis of some of the results. And I've given you a list here of some of the areas of focus. But we will certainly be mining this data, and we'll be looking to our partners as well to identify those areas that they feel are critically important for their own business, for us to be able to explore the data and make the best use of it possible. So I'll stop there.